Senator Matt Canavan, thanks for speaking with us on Flow.
Good to be here, Ricky.
You've been saying a fair bit about this net zero debate. Can you just give us a quick summary from your point of view what it's about? And this summit happening virtually involving Joe Biden, the Chinese president, and our own Prime Minister, Scott Morrison.
Well, I think how net zero has sort of come about, if you like, is that it's net zero emissions by 2050. That's what most countries are sort of moving towards. And I think they've done that because most countries haven't met the targets they initially committed to back in the Kyoto Agreement, which was signed in 1998. And those commitments came due last year in 2020. And almost every country failed. So Japan didn't meet their targets. Canada didn't meet its targets. New Zealand even didn't meet its targets. Australia, one of the few countries that did.
Yep.
So, of course, what's the best tactic when you don't meet something you've initially committed to? You then say, "Oh, well, I didn't do what I promised today, but I'll do something better tomorrow." And so that's how we've ended up with this 2050 sort of target. And I think it'd be damaging for our country because we actually do what we say. And if we commit to this target, it will cause thousands of job losses in industries which we rely on.
And you've mentioned in your commentary about this, about the cattle sector as one example, looking at our regional communities. If we try and get to net zero, what's that going to mean, for instance, to our livestock industry?
Yeah, well, agriculture is about 15% of our carbon emissions. Each cow emits around 100 kilograms of carbon dioxide a year. And there potentially is a massive cost here. There's no technology to reduce that to zero. The only real way we could look at getting there to net, that's where the net comes in, is offsetting it. So that's how we've met our target. So I said we've met our Kyoto target. We haven't actually reduced our emissions in the cities. We're still emitting about the same as we did in non-agricultural sectors, as we did 20 years ago. That barely has changed. What we've done is we've planted a lot of trees. We've converted what used to be agricultural land back into forest. And the way the accounting rules work, that gives us an offset and lets us meet our targets. Now, we've reforested about 6 million hectares of land in Australia to achieve what we've done so far, which is our target was a 5% cut in emissions. Now we're talking to go 100%, obviously, to go to net zero.
Yep.
If we were to do that through tree planting, we'd have to cover the whole of New South Wales with trees.
But the Kiwis...
And you can imagine what impact that could have on agriculture. That's my real concern here, is that we'll lose good agricultural land, and there are not many jobs in a forest. A lot of trees, but not many people working on them.
No, and the Kiwis, I understand, they're thinning their herd to try and meet these targets. That's another way that we would get there?
That's a potential option. As I said, New Zealand haven't done much so far. They emit about the same as they did 20 years ago. They've had basically zero reduction in emissions. They have excluded agriculture for now from their net zero target.
That's my next question, is agriculture excluded in Australia or not? You see some of the National Farmers Federation seem to want agriculture to be a participant in reductions of carbon emissions, but certainly what's your party's position on excluding ag? Should we be doing what New Zealand's doing?
Well, I mean, I can't speak for my whole party, but I don't want to do it at all. So I don't want to start talking exclusions because I'm also worried about the impact on other industries as well, be it mining or manufacturing, and that's a big thing we've got to do now is rebuild our manufacturing. So I think this policy weakens our ability to do that, and that's very important for South Australia. But yes, other countries have gone down that route where they've sought to exclude certain industries. In New Zealand, half of their carbon emissions come from farming, from the dairy sector primarily, and they've just excluded it. Now, they're going to review that in 2025, so they potentially might in the future have to take steps like reducing herd size. And that's also been proposed here in Australia, that we'd have to reduce the size of our herd to cut our emissions, because we just couldn't plant enough trees, as I was saying. That's just probably impractical. So is that what we want? We want to weaken ourselves? This policy is all about making us bus poorer.
Yeah.
Cutting carbon emissions in this kind of aggressive way will mean that we'll produce less, we'll make less, we'll have fewer jobs, and just at a time when we're facing a rising threat from an aggressive Chinese Communist Party. They're not going to do anything, as we've seen, to reduce their carbon emissions. So they'll just take the jobs, take the industry, and strengthen themselves while we weaken ourselves. And that is a really, really insane policy from my perspective, given the threats we see in our region.
Wayne Phillips, our morning show host, has been talking about how China has built a great many coal-fired power stations in the last year or so. And I saw your tweet earlier this morning when we recorded this interview that if we're not going to do a Belt and Road deal through the Andrews government in Victoria, why would we be signing a climate deal with them?
Well, I think that's the strongest argument against net zero emissions. I mean, let's just say you accept all the climate change and you do think we need to, as a world, go to zero emissions in the next 30 years. Let's say that is a given, right? Let's take it as a given. Even if you did want to do that and you did think that was necessary, you're only going to be effective if you can convince all countries, especially the large ones like China, to act with you. And so those that are pushing the net zero emissions policy have to answer the simple question to everybody. Do they trust China? Do they trust them? Because if you don't trust the Chinese Communist Party and the Chinese government, why would you sign up to this agreement? Because they're not going to meet their commitments then if you don't trust them. They are a third of the world's carbon emissions already, the largest emitter in the world. And if we all tie our own industry up with green tape and restrictions on what they can do, that will just strengthen China. They'll take more of our factories, more of our jobs over to their country and be able to make more staff and strengthen themselves compared to what we can do. Now, so the only way this works is if you can trust China. And I just think the very, very putting of that question shows the absurdity of what we're doing here. We've got limited resources as a country, and we need to focus right now on defending ourselves, restoring our manufacturing capacity, and the net zero emissions objective, the discussion around it, is all inhibiting that goal, all preventing us getting back to actually making things in this country, restoring our economic strength, and make sure that if there is a conflict in our region, which is definitely a major possibility, we can actually defend ourselves and not just outsource all our nation's defence to the US and others.
So when we're talking about China, the other thing that happened coincidental or concurrently, I guess, with the decision to block the Belt and Road deal in Victoria is the conclusion of the Liverpool Plains mining exercise with Shenhua's Watermark Company, and that's a Chinese state-owned corporation, if I've got that correctly. What's your view on what's happened there on the Liverpool Plains? So they were looking at doing coal mining there, but the farmers, some of them, didn't want that to happen. Has the right call been made there?
Look, I'm a big supporter of coal mining. I think it's very important for our country. It's our second biggest export. There's a strong future given we have very high quality coals and really the only type of coking coal to make steel anywhere. There's nothing like it in the world. So we'll continue to have demand for it. That doesn't mean we should have coal mines everywhere, though. There are going to be some parts of the country where they're inappropriate. And I don't support mining on the Liverpool Plains. I did support the previous buyback the New South Wales government did years ago to BHP, where there was mining. It was very close and almost on the Liverpool Plains. I mean, I would say this one here, though, this particular project, the Watermark project, from the discussions I've had with locals, and I'm not a local in the area, but the discussions I've had, that project wasn't actually on the Liverpool Plains. It's quite a fair way from them. And it didn't necessarily seem to me to risk that farming, that land, that productive farming land. So I think it's disappointing that possibly is not proceeding. That this is a separate from the issues around a Chinese state entity. The New South Wales government's announced now that we won't have that mining. I know, speaking to lots of local government officials and others, locals in the area, they are disappointed with the decision because that area, that Gunnedah area, is doing very well out of mining. The Whitehaven, Maules Creek mine's been a boon for that area. They've got industry, they've got professional jobs in Gunnedah now, thanks to that operation. And they're actually looking forward to having some other mines to spur their development and job opportunities in a small town again. So, Look, that's the decision that's been made, though. But the principle should be that we do support mining and support the jobs and wealth it creates, but that doesn't mean it should happen everywhere.
Given we've got a South Australian audience in our broadcast area, a couple of things that relate to what you've said there. One of them is this push in Whyalla for hydrogen. We've had the local member, Rowan Ramsey, saying it's great news that there's $200 million being invested potentially in a hydrogen plant there. And there's all this talk of green steel. Now, I come back to your comment just now about coking coal, and that's the best to develop steel with. Do you see much in the foreseeable future in green steel?
Look, I think it's a fair way away. I want to say at the outset, I'm not anti-hydrogen. When I was Minister for Resources, provided significant extra funding and support for hydrogen. In saying that, I think we've got to be very careful here we don't put all our eggs in one basket. Hydrogen has been spoken about for decades as a potential alternative to coking coal and other energy fuels. And it hasn't come off. There are a lot of challenges to make hydrogen work. And I can't sit here and say, yep, I 100% for sure that in 10, 15, whatever years' time, we're going to be using hydrogen steel or hydrogen for transport, etc. I don't know. And again, back to the other central point I've made here, the risks we face right now with conflict potentially the next 10 years over Taiwan or other Chinese aggression in our region, we've got to be a bit careful we don't put all our eggs in the basket of things that may work. Because if they don't come off, the cost of them not coming off could be absolutely dire for our nation and national security. So I do think, on balance, we need to put a little bit more resources back into things that we know can work, that absolutely we can buy off the shelf. Like a clean coal-fired power station. We know that works. China's building 100 of them right now. We can do it. We can build gas-fired power. We know that works. There's no uncertainty really there by building one. Even I'd say nuclear. That should be on the agenda. Nuclear as well. Well-established, known technology, although it would take a while to get going here. But the hydrogen, batteries, all of these things, they are uncertain. They are a risk, and they may not happen.
And that brings me to the conversation. My last question, you've mentioned it now already, nuclear. Speaking with Rowan Ramsey recently on the program we talked about, he mentioned hot rocks, volunteered that this whole hot rocks technology, there was excitement about that, proved that there wasn't much in it, and he said he acknowledged that hydrogen, is potentially some way off. And I asked him about small modular reactors and the nuclear scenario, particularly given, if I can put it this way, it seems to me South Australia is to uranium what Queensland is to coal when it comes to the reserves that we've got. We've got heaps of it. But we're not using it. You've mentioned nuclear just now. If there was a race between nuclear and hydrogen in terms of a small modular scenario, for instance, who would get there first in your estimation?
That's a tough question, mate. Look, the only thing I'd say is, as I said before, nuclear is an established technology. Small modular reactors can work. They're very similar in design to what is used in nuclear submarines. The issue for them is just getting the cost down so that they're competitive. A little bit similar in the case of hydrogen, although hydrogen does have other challenges around the transport, its flammability, etc. But getting both of those fuel sources or types of power generation technologies down to a low enough cost is remains a big challenge. Of course, we could build a Generation 3 standard nuclear power station. They are well established and well known in terms of their costs and risks.
Yep.
But these other technologies it is uncertain. I don't know. I don't have an answer for you. But I do think we should be investing in all these technologies, and that's why myself and my Nationals colleagues in the Senate recently, we sought to amend the Clean Energy Finance Corporation Act so that it could invest in nuclear technologies like small modular reactors, like Generation 4 technologies, which produce a lot less waste. I think we should be at least keeping these options on the table, investing in them. We're not going to build a power station tomorrow, but we may want to in 10 or 15 years' time, and it would be a little bit silly for us not to at least advance things on this front, so that if future Australians do think we need to build nuclear for low emissions, security, energy reliability, that we're at least not starting from square one. So I think the debate is advancing on nuclear a little, personally, and you're right to say South Australia soon will be the only producer of uranium in Australia. The Ranger mine in Northern Territory will shut in the next couple of years. And we do have to move away from this absurdity that we export all our natural resources to other countries, be it coal or iron ore or gas or uranium. Yet we don't use a lot of it here. I mean, in the case of uranium, we use none. That doesn't seem to me the smart strategy for a growing and developing nation.
It seems to be a pathway to smashing net zero as well, if that's what you care about.
Absolutely, mate. And there was just a study the other day showing that really, if the world is going to go to net zero, we're kidding ourselves if we're not going to significantly expand the amount of nuclear power in the world. I mean, the amount of energy the world needs every year to keep going is just enormous. I mean, if you take coal, just as an example here, the International Energy Agency projections for coal use over the next 20 years, they have it going flat, so they don't have it growing, just flat. But what it would mean for the first 40 years of this century, if their projections are true, is the first 40 years of this century would use more coal in that 40 years than we ever have in history before, going back to the Industrial Revolution. That's how much energy demand there is in Asia. It's a big place. There's lots of people that still lots of them without electricity. And then you've got Africa sitting in the background, and whether or not its economy fires. So there's about 1 billion people in the world that don't have access to electricity. So providing them energy is an enormous task that can't be met alone from renewables. There'll have to be a mix of energy types, just as there always will be. I think there'll still be a lot of coal used, And if, of course, we want to reduce emissions significantly, we're going to have to look at technologies like nuclear too.
Yeah, well, that'll all be sitting in the background, I'm sure, when all the world leaders meet that are invited to the Biden Climate Summit in their virtual summit. So we'll track that with interest. You've been very generous with your time, Senator Canavan, so thank you for speaking with us on Flow today.
No worries, mate. You have a good one. Thank you.